How could he do this to his own sons?
August 14th, 2019. A San Francisco courtroom fell into absolute chaos when the will of tech billionaire Richard Caldwell was read aloud to a room full of attorneys, journalists, and family members who thought they knew exactly how this story would end. Preston Caldwell and Miles Caldwell, two sons born into unimaginable privilege, raised in $100 million estate, educated at the finest schools money could buy, sat in those leather chairs expecting to inherit their father's $800 million empire. They'd waited for this moment their entire lives. They'd planned for it, dreamed about it, built their futures around it. And in less than 60 seconds, their entire world collapsed. The estate attorney cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and read the words that would ignite a legal battle so explosive it would dominate headlines for years. To Preston Caldwell, son, I leave nothing. To Miles Caldwell, son, I leave nothing. To Daniel Herrera, son of my gardener Miguel Herrera, I leave the entirety of my estate, all assets, all properties, all shares in Caldwell Technologies, totaling approximately $800 million. The room erupted. Preston lunged across the table. Miles sat frozen, his face drained of all color. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. And in the back of that courtroom, a 26-year-old kid in a borrowed suit, a kid who'd spent his entire childhood trimming hedges and pulling weeds on that same estate his brothers partied on, sat trembling, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Daniel Herrera, the invisible boy, the gardener's son, had just become one of the wealthiest young men in America. And his brothers, the golden boys, the entitled heirs, walked out with absolutely nothing. But here's what nobody in that courtroom knew. This wasn't just about money. This wasn't some eccentric billionaire's final act of cruelty or a random gesture of kindness to a loyal employee's child. This was about a secret so devastating, so carefully buried, that when it finally came to light, it would destroy reputations, end careers, and force everyone who heard this story to question everything they thought they knew about family, loyalty, and what we actually owe the people who share our blood. Because Richard Caldwell didn't just cut off his sons on a whim. He'd been planning this for over a decade. He'd been watching, waiting, gathering evidence. And when he finally made his move, he didn't just rewrite his will. He rewrote his entire legacy. The question everyone wanted answered was simple. Why? Why would a father annihilate his own children? What did Daniel Herrera do to deserve $800 million? And what secret was buried so deep that it took a billionaire's death to bring it into the light? By the time you reach the end of this story, you'll have your answers. But I promise you this, nothing about this case is what it seems. Not the father, not the sons, not the gardener's boy, and definitely not the truth. Before we go any deeper into this story, before we uncover the secrets that tore apart one of America's wealthiest families, I want to hear from you. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because stories like this, stories that challenge everything you think you know about wealth, power, and family, these are the stories we live for. And trust me, we've got plenty more coming your way. Now, to understand how we got to that courtroom on August 14th, to understand why a billionaire would completely disinherit his biological sons and hand his entire fortune to the child of his employee, we need to go back, way back, to 1973, to a cold, gray Pittsburgh winter, to a 12-year-old boy named Richard Caldwell who was about to learn the lesson that would define his entire life. Richard wasn't born into wealth. He was born into something much harsher. His father, Joseph Caldwell, worked at a steel mill. 60-hour weeks. Destroyed hands. A temperament shaped by exhaustion and disappointment. His mother, Claire, worked nights as a nurse, came home too tired to speak, collapsed into bed before dawn. Richard was the youngest of 4 children, but he was different. Quieter. Smarter. While his brothers followed their father into the mills, Richard disappeared into books. Physics. Mathematics. Engineering. He taught himself calculus at 14. Built a radio from scrapped parts at 15. By 16, he'd won a full scholarship to MIT, the first person in his family to even finish high school, let alone attend college. But here's the thing about Richard Caldwell that most people never understood. That scholarship didn't feel like a gift. It felt like an escape. Because the night before he left for Boston, His father sat him down at their kitchen table, looked him dead in the eye, and said something Richard would never forget. "You think you're better than us now, don't you? You think that fancy school is going to make you somebody? Let me tell you something, son. Blood is blood. You can run as far as you want, but you'll always be a Caldwell. And Caldwells don't amount to nothing." Richard never spoke to his father again. Not at graduation. Not at his wedding. Not even when Joseph died of lung disease in 1994. Because Richard had made a promise to himself that night. He would prove his father wrong. He would build something so big, so undeniable, that nobody would ever question his worth again. And he did. By 1985, at just 32 years old, Richard Caldwell had turned a garage startup into one of the most important server infrastructure companies in Silicon Valley. By 1992, Caldwell Technologies was worth over $1 billion. Richard was on magazine covers, speaking at conferences, dining with senators. He'd done it. He'd escaped Pittsburgh. He'd escaped his father's voice. He'd escaped poverty. But here's what he couldn't escape: himself. Richard Caldwell was brilliant, visionary, ruthless, but he was also emotionally frozen. Former employees described him as a machine. He didn't do small talk. He didn't celebrate wins. He fired people over email. He once told an executive who asked for time off to attend his daughter's wedding, "Your family is not my problem, your performance is." Richard didn't care if people liked him. He cared if they respected him. And respect, in his mind, was earned through fear. He never smiled in photos. Never attended company parties. He lived alone in a San Francisco penthouse, worked 18-hour days, and by all accounts, seemed perfectly content with his isolation. Until he met Eleanor Grant. Eleanor was everything Richard wasn't. Warm, social, effortlessly charming. The daughter of a Boston real estate mogul, she moved in circles Richard had only recently been admitted to. They met at a charity gala in 1990. Richard was there because his publicist insisted. Eleanor was there because her family had organized it. She approached him, made a joke about how uncomfortable he looked, and for the first time in his adult life, Richard Caldwell laughed. They were married 6 months later. And for a brief moment, people who knew Richard thought maybe, just maybe, Eleanor would soften him. Maybe she'd teach him how to be human. And in some ways, she did. Richard started coming home earlier. He attended dinners. He even smiled occasionally. And then, in 1992, Eleanor gave birth to their first son, Preston. 2 years later, in 1994, their second son, Miles, was born. Richard Caldwell was now a father. And everyone assumed he'd be terrible at it. They were right. Richard loved his sons the way he loved his company. Theoretically, he provided for them, paid for the best schools, the best tutors, the best everything. But he didn't know how to connect with them. He didn't go to their soccer games. He didn't read them bedtime stories. He didn't ask about their days. When Preston was 7, he drew a picture of his family for school. He included his mother, his brother, the family dog. He left out his father. Eleanor found the drawing and cried. Richard found it and said nothing. But then, in 1998, everything changed. Eleanor was driving home from a charity event in Palo Alto. It was raining. A semi-truck ran a red light. She died on impact. She was 34 years old. Preston was 6. Miles was 4. And Richard Caldwell, the man who'd built an empire on control and precision, completely fell apart. He didn't cry at the funeral. He didn't speak. He stood at the grave, blank-faced, while his sons sobbed into their grandmother's arms. And when it was over, when everyone went home, Richard went back to work. He buried himself in code, in meetings, in acquisitions, because work was the only thing that made sense. Work didn't ask questions. Work didn't need comfort. Work didn't die, but his sons did need comfort, and they didn't get it. Preston and Miles grew up in a 40,000 square foot estate in Atherton, raised by nannies, tutors, housekeepers. They had everything except the one thing they actually needed: a father. And that absence, that gaping emotional void, turned them into exactly the kind of men you'd expect. Preston, the older brother, was charismatic, charming, and completely hollow. He learned early that his last name opened doors, that his father's money could erase mistakes. By 15, he'd been expelled from 2 private schools. By 17, he'd totaled 3 cars. By 19, he had his first DUI. His second came at 22, this time with cocaine in the glove compartment. Richard paid for the lawyers, paid for the settlements, paid to make the stories disappear. But he never once sat his son down and asked him why. He just wrote the checks and moved on. Preston took that as permission. Permission to keep going. Keep failing. Keep coasting. Because no matter how badly he screwed up, Daddy's money would fix it. And when he turned 25 and got access to his first trust fund, $15 million, he blew through it in under 3 years. Failed nightclubs. Bad investments. Gambling debts in Vegas and Monaco. By 30, Preston Caldwell was broke. But he didn't care. Because he knew the real money was coming. The inheritance. 800 million reasons to wait. Miles, the younger brother, took a different path. He wasn't wild like Preston. He was calculating. Cold. He studied law at Yale, not because he loved it, but because he understood power. He joined his father's company as general counsel, not to contribute, but to position himself. Miles didn't waste money. He hoarded it. He saw the world as a zero-sum game. Winners and losers. Predators and prey. And he made sure he was always on the right side of that equation. Employees hated him. He'd fire people for minor mistakes. He'd humiliate assistants in meetings. He once told a junior attorney who asked for a raise, "You're replaceable. Act like it." But Miles didn't care if people liked him. Just like his father. The difference was, Richard earned his cruelty. Miles inherited his. And deep down, Miles knew that. Deep down, he knew he'd never built anything. Never earned anything. Never been anything except Richard Caldwell's son. And that knowledge ate at him. Made him meaner. Sharper. More desperate to prove he deserved his place. But he didn't. And his father knew it. By 2010, Richard Caldwell was 67 years old. His company was worth over $2 billion. His sons were in their 30s. And he hated them. Not openly. Richard was too controlled for that. But in private moments, in the journals he kept locked in his study, he wrote things that would later be released during the trial. Things like, "I gave them everything and taught them nothing. They are my greatest failure." Or, "Preston is a parasite. Miles is a tyrant. Neither of them has ever created a single thing of value. They wait for me to die like vultures circling a corpse." And perhaps the most damning entry, dated March 3, 2010. "I have 2 biological sons. But I am not their father. I am their bank. And when I am gone, they will learn what it means to have nothing." That entry was written 3 weeks after Richard Caldwell discovered something that would change everything. Something he'd never suspected. Something that would lead, 9 years later, to that courtroom, to that will, to the complete destruction of his son's futures. But we'll get to that. First, you need to understand who Daniel Herrera was, and how a gardener's son became the most important person in a billionaire's life. 1995. Miguel Herrera crossed the border into California with $200, a duffel bag, and a dream that had kept him alive through 2 years of saving, planning, and praying. He was 28 years old. He didn't speak English. He had no contacts, no job, no safety net. What he did have was a wife, Maria, and a willingness to do whatever it took to build a life worth living. Miguel's first job in America was washing dishes at a diner in San Jose. 14-hour shifts. $7 an hour. He slept in his truck. Showered at gas stations. Sent every spare dollar back to Maria in Guadalajara. He did that for 2 years. And then, in 1997, he saw an ad in a Spanish-language newspaper. Gardener needed. Large estate. Experience required. Miguel had grown up on a farm. He knew plants. He knew soil. He knew hard work. He applied. And to his shock, he got the job. The estate was Richard Caldwell's. 50 acres in Atherton. Gardens. Orchards. Tennis courts. A staff of 12. Miguel was hired to maintain the grounds. And he did. Quietly. Perfectly. Invisibly. Richard barely noticed him. Why would he? Miguel was just another employee. Another face in the background. But Miguel noticed Richard. Noticed how he walked the grounds alone. How he never smiled. How he seemed to carry the weight of the entire world on his shoulders. And Miguel, in his quiet way, respected that. Because he understood it. The loneliness of ambition. The cost of building something from nothing. In 2000, Maria finally got her visa. She joined Miguel in California. They rented a tiny apartment in East Palo Alto. And in 2001, Maria gave birth to a son, Daniel, born in the United States. A citizen. The future Miguel had dreamed of. Daniel grew up in 2 worlds. At home, he spoke Spanish. Ate his mother's cooking. Listened to stories about Guadalajara. But outside, he was American. He went to public school. Played baseball. watch cartoons. And every weekend, he'd go with his father to work, to the Caldwell estate. And while Miguel trimmed hedges and mowed lawns, Daniel explored. He'd wander the property, climb trees, skip stones in the pond. And sometimes, when Preston and Miles were home from boarding school, he'd see them. The sons. The golden boys. They never spoke to him. Never even looked at him. To them, he was invisible. Just the gardener's kid. But Daniel didn't mind. He was used to being invisible. And honestly, he preferred it that way. But there was one person who did notice Daniel. Richard Caldwell. It started small. Richard would see the boy reading under a tree while his father worked. He'd see him sketching in a notebook, building things out of sticks and wire. And one day, in 2008, when Daniel was 7, Richard walked over and asked him what he was building. Daniel looked up, terrified. This was the owner, the boss, the man his father worked for. But Richard's tone wasn't harsh. It was curious. And so Daniel showed him. A small bridge, made from twigs and string, structurally sound, balanced. Richard knelt down, studied it, and then he said something that would change Daniel's life. You're smart. Don't waste it. And he walked away. That was it. 10 seconds. For words. But to Daniel, it meant everything. Because nobody had ever called him smart before. Not his teachers. Not his parents. Nobody. And coming from Richard Caldwell, a man who'd built an empire on intelligence, those words carried weight. From that day on, Richard started paying attention. He'd ask Daniel questions. What are you reading? What do you want to be when you grow up? Do you like math? And Daniel, shy and awkward, would answer. And Richard would listen. Really listen. In a way he'd never listened to his own sons. By 2012, when Daniel was 11, Richard was doing more than just talking to him. He was mentoring him. He'd invite Daniel into his study, show him books, explain concepts, physics, engineering, business strategy. He'd give Daniel problems to solve, equations, puzzles, logic games, and Daniel devoured them. He was hungry for it, hungry for knowledge, hungry for someone to believe in him. And Richard saw that hunger, recognized it, because it was the same hunger he'd had as a kid in Pittsburgh, the hunger to prove you're more than where you came from. By the time Daniel was in high school, Richard was paying for his tutors, his SAT prep, his college applications. Miguel didn't know how to feel about it. On one hand, he was grateful. His son was getting opportunities he could never provide. But on the other hand, it felt strange. Why was this billionaire so invested in his son? What did he want in return? But Richard never asked for anything. He just kept giving. And in 2017, when Daniel got accepted to Stanford with a full scholarship, Richard was the first person he told. Not his parents. Richard. Because by then, Richard wasn't just a mentor. He was the closest thing Daniel had to a father figure. And Richard felt the same way. Because Daniel was everything his biological sons weren't. Humble. Hardworking. Grateful. Curious. Kind. Daniel didn't expect anything. Didn't demand anything. He just earned everything. And for the first time in his life, Richard Caldwell felt something he'd never felt before. Pride. Not in what he'd built, but in who he'd helped become. But here's the thing nobody knew. Not Miguel. Not Maria. Not even Daniel. Richard's interest in Daniel wasn't just mentorship. It wasn't just kindness. It was something much deeper. Much more complicated. Because in March of 2010, Richard Caldwell received an anonymous letter. No return address. Just a single page. Typed. It read, "You have 3 sons, not 2. Ask Maria Herrera about 1999. Richard didn't understand. Maria Herrera? His gardener's wife? What did she have to do with anything? And then he remembered. 1999. A housekeeper. Temporary. Hired for 3 months while the regular staff was on leave. Quiet. Young. Mexican. Richard had barely noticed her. Except for one night. One stupid, reckless, uncharacteristic night. He'd been drinking. Rare for him. He'd been alone in the house. Eleanor had been dead for a year. He was drowning. And Maria was there. Kind. Sympathetic. It happened once. One time. And the next morning, Richard was so disgusted with himself he fired her. Paid her severance. Told her never to come back. And he never thought about it again. Until that letter. Richard hired a private investigator. Discreetly. And what he found shattered him. Maria had left California in late 1999. Pregnant. She'd gone back to Mexico. Had the baby there. A boy. Born in April 2000. And then, in 2000, she'd married Miguel Herrera. A good man. a man who believed the child was his. And in 2001, they'd had another son, also named Daniel. Wait, two Daniels? No, the investigator had made an error. There was only one Daniel, born in 2001. But the dates didn't add up. Richard demanded a deeper investigation. And that's when the truth came out. The devastating, life-altering truth. Daniel Herrera, born April 16, 2000, was not Miguel's biological son. He was Richard Caldwell's. The boy Richard had been mentoring for years. The boy he'd grown to care about. The boy who reminded him of himself. Was his son. His actual, biological son. And he'd had no idea. Richard sat in his office for 3 days. Didn't sleep. Didn't eat. Just stared at the DNA results the investigator had obtained. 99.9% match. Daniel was his. But here's what made it even more complicated. Maria didn't know Richard knew. Miguel didn't know at all. He believed Daniel was his. Loved him as his own. Raised him as his own. And Daniel? Daniel had no clue. He thought Miguel was his father. Richard had a choice. He could tell the truth. Destroy Miguel's family. Destroy Maria's marriage. Destroy Daniel's entire sense of identity. Or he could stay silent. Keep the secret. And just watch. Just be there. Just help the boy become everything he was capable of becoming. Richard chose silence. But he also chose something else. He chose to punish the sons who'd failed him. And reward the son who'd earned his respect. Without even knowing they were related. From 2010 to 2019, Richard Caldwell lived a double life. Publicly, he was the cold, calculating billionaire. Privately, he was a father. To Daniel, he paid for everything. Tutors, books, college, internships. But he never told Daniel why. Never explained the real reason he cared so much. And Daniel, humble and grateful, just assumed Richard saw potential in him. Saw something worth investing in. He had no idea he was investing in his own son. But Richard knew. And that knowledge changed him. Made him realize how badly he'd failed with Preston and Miles. How he'd given them money but not guidance. Wealth but not wisdom. They'd had every advantage and squandered it. Daniel had nothing and built everything. And so, Richard made a decision. A decision that would culminate in that courtroom in 2019. He was going to rewrite his will. Cut off Preston and Miles entirely. And leave everything to Daniel. Not because Daniel was his biological son. Richard didn't care about blood. His own father had taught him that blood meant nothing. No, Richard was leaving everything to Daniel because Daniel had earned it. Because Daniel represented everything Richard valued. Hard work, intelligence, humility, integrity. And because Richard wanted to send a message. To his sons. To the world. To himself. That character mattered more than genetics. That legacy wasn't about who you were born to. It was about who you became. In 2017, Richard was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. 18 months to live. And he knew it was time. Time to finalize everything. He changed law firms. Hired attorneys his sons didn't know. And he drafted a new will. The will that would destroy Preston and Miles. And change Daniel's life forever. But Richard didn't just write a will. He wrote a letter. A letter to be read after his death. A letter explaining everything. And in that letter, he told Daniel the truth. The truth about Maria. About that night in 1999. About the DNA test. About the fact that they were father and son. Richard knew this revelation would devastate Daniel. Would upend his entire world. But he also knew Daniel deserved the truth. Deserved to know why Richard had cared. Why he'd invested. Why he'd chosen him. And so he wrote it all down. Every detail. Every regret. Every hope. And he sealed it. To be opened only after the will was read. Only after Daniel inherited everything. Because Richard knew his sons would fight. Would sue. Would try to destroy Daniel. And he wanted Daniel to have the full story before that battle began. Richard Caldwell died on August 10, 2019, at 76 years old. Surrounded by nurses. Alone. Preston and Miles came to the hospital. Not out of love. But obligation. They stood at his bedside. Stiff and uncomfortable. And Richard, barely conscious, looked at them one last time. And he said something. Something that would haunt them. He looked at Preston and whispered, "You were never mine." And then he closed his eyes. And he was gone. Preston and Miles didn't understand. Were never mine? What did that mean? Were they adopted? Illegitimate? They demanded answers from the nurses, the doctors, the attorneys. But nobody knew. And 4 days later, when the will was read, they found out. Not about the DNA. Not about Daniel being Richard's son, just that they'd been cut off. Completely. Entirely. And that Daniel Herrera, a kid they'd never even spoken to, had inherited $800 million. The brothers lost their minds. Preston screamed. Threw chairs. Had to be escorted out by security. Miles sat frozen. His face pale. His hands shaking. And then he did what Miles always did. He started planning. Planning how to fight. How to win. How to take back what he believed was rightfully his. Within a week, Preston and Miles had hired a team of attorneys. The best money could buy. Well, money they borrowed. Because they didn't have any. They filed a lawsuit alleging undue influence. Claiming Daniel had manipulated their dying father. Isolated him. Poisoned his mind against his own sons. They had no evidence. But they didn't need evidence. They just needed headlines. And they got them. Gardner's son accused of elder abuse. Billionaires will contested by grieving sons. The media ate it up. Talk shows debated it. Twitter exploded. And Daniel, suddenly thrust into the spotlight, had no idea what to do. He didn't want the money. He didn't want the attention. He just wanted his life back. But that life was gone. Because his name was now attached to the biggest inheritance scandal in years. And Preston and Miles were determined to destroy him. They hired private investigators. Dug into his past. Looked for anything they could use. Drug use. Criminal record. Academic dishonesty. Anything. But they found nothing. Because Daniel was clean. Painfully, frustratingly clean. So they went after his parents. They investigated Miguel. Maria. Looking for fraud. Immigration violations. Tax evasion. Anything. And that's when they stumbled onto something. Something that changed everything. In December 2019, Preston's legal team obtained Richard's medical records. Legally questionable. But they did it. And buried in those records was a lab report. A DNA test. Ordered by Richard in March 2010. Comparing his DNA to an unknown sample. The results showed a match. A familial match. But the name on the sample was redacted. Sealed by court order. Preston's team pushed harder. Bribed a lab technician. And got the name. Daniel Herrera. The courtroom exploded when this was leaked. Richard Caldwell had a secret son. And that son was Daniel. The gardener's boy. The heir. The media went insane. Billionaire's secret love child inherits fortune. DNA test proves Gardner's son is biological heir. Suddenly, the narrative flipped. This wasn't a case of manipulation. This was a father leaving his fortune to his actual son. And cutting off the two sons who'd failed him. Public opinion shifted. Hard. People started siding with Daniel. Calling Preston and Miles entitled brats. Saying they deserved to be cut off. And Preston and Miles, desperate and humiliated, doubled down. They claimed the DNA test was fabricated. That Daniel and Richard had conspired to fake it. That this was all part of a long con. But they had no proof. And their credibility was crumbling. And then Daniel's legal team fired back. With something the brothers never saw coming. In January 2020, Daniel's attorneys released financial records. Records showing that Preston and Miles had been embezzling from their father's company for over 15 years. Fake invoices. Shell companies. Offshore accounts. Over $120 million. Stolen. Slowly. Carefully. Methodically. And Richard had known. He'd known for years. Because he'd been building a case. He'd hired forensic accountants in 2015. Documented everything. Every wire transfer. Every fake expense report. Every bribe. He had emails. Testimony. Bank statements. Everything he needed to send his sons to prison. But he didn't. Because he wanted them to suffer differently. He wanted them to lose everything publicly. To be humiliated. Exposed. Destroyed. And that's exactly what happened. The evidence was ironclad. Preston and Miles's attorneys saw it and immediately advised them to drop the lawsuit. Because if they continued, Richard's estate would file criminal charges. And they'd go to jail. Faced with prison, the brothers had no choice. They dropped the case. Released a statement saying they respected their father's wishes. And they walked away. With nothing. Not the inheritance. Not their reputations. Not even their dignity. They were broke. Disgraced. And completely alone. But here's where the story takes a turn. A turn nobody expected. Because Daniel Herrera could have walked away. Could have taken the $800 million. Moved to another country. Started over. Never thought about the Caldwell family again. But he didn't. Because in February 2020, Daniel opened the sealed letter Richard had left him. The letter explaining everything. The affair, the DNA test, the years of silence, the decision to mentor him without ever revealing the truth. And at the end of that letter, Richard wrote something that broke Daniel. He wrote, "I failed as a father twice. With Preston and Miles, I gave them everything but love. With you, I gave you nothing but belief. You didn't need my money. You needed my respect. And you earned it. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you the truth while I was alive. But I hope you understand. I loved you not because you were my son, but because you were the man I wish I'd been." Daniel read that letter 3 times. And then he cried. For the first time since Richard died. Because he realized something. Richard hadn't just given him money. He'd given him a choice. A choice about what kind of man he wanted to be. Did he want to be like Richard? Cold. Isolated. Driven by revenge? Or did he want to be better? And so Daniel made a decision. A decision that shocked everyone. In March 2020, Daniel reached out to Preston and Miles. Privately. No lawyers. No press. Just the 3 of them. And he made them an offer. He'd give them each $10 million. No strings attached. But on one condition. They had to work. Real jobs. For 5 years. If they succeeded, if they stayed employed, stayed sober, stayed out of trouble, they'd get another $40 million each. If they failed, the money would go to charity. Preston and Miles were furious. 10 million? After losing 800 million? It was an insult. But it was also the only offer they were going to get. And so they took it. Preston took his 10 million and blew through it in 18 months. Gambling. Drugs. Bad investments. Last anyone heard, he was working at a car dealership in Reno. Barely scraping by. Miles, on the other hand, took the deal seriously. He got sober. Started a small law practice. Nothing fancy. Just honest work. He and Daniel don't speak. But once, in 2022, Miles sent Daniel a letter. It was short. Just 2 words. "Thank you." Daniel never responded. But he kept the letter. As for Daniel, he's now worth over $3 billion. He renamed the company Herrera Caldwell Enterprises. Expanded into renewable energy. Hired his father Miguel as a consultant. Moved his mother Maria into the estate. And every year, on Richard's birthday, he visits the grave. And he reads him a letter. Nobody knows what those letters say. But people who've seen Daniel at the cemetery say he always leaves smiling. Because Richard Caldwell, the man who spent his entire life building walls, who never learned how to love his sons, who died alone and bitter, somehow managed to do one thing right. He saw potential in a boy who had nothing, and he gave him a chance. Not because of blood, but because of character. And in doing so, he created a legacy worth more than any fortune. A legacy of second chances, of earned respect, of proving that who you become matters more than who you were born to be. So here's the question I'll leave you with. Was Richard Caldwell right? Should he have cut off his sons? Was it justice or cruelty? Did he destroy Preston and Miles to prove a point? Or did he give them exactly what they deserved? And what about Daniel? Did he earn that $800 million? Or was he just lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time? I want to hear what you think. Leave your answers in the comments. Because this story isn't just about one family. It's about all of us. It's about what we owe the people we bring into this world. It's about whether love is something you're born into or something you earn. And it's about the difference between inheritance and legacy. Because Richard Caldwell left his biological sons nothing. But he left Daniel everything. And in the end, maybe that was the most honest thing he ever did.